Hello, thank you for tuning in. This is for debate number 3 for Dr. Ripley's Global Problems and Issues in Global Problems and Debates class. Today I'm going to be talking about my point on how I believe developmental considerations outweighs the environmental preservation when you're trying to, in world politics. I have 3 main points I'm going to be talking about, and I have one example of a nation that has, over the past 50 years, grown from agricultural prosperity to an industrialized world and become a huge first world superpower. My first main point I'm talking about is how nations require developmental considerations to prosper and fight towards first world core values. We talked about in this class dependency theory, also named world systems theory, where core nations take advantage of periphery and semi-periphery nations for their resources and for economic strength and strengthening their own. If we force these periphery and semi-periphery nations to make economic sanctions to it will tie down their economy and it will not grow up to the standards that they would want to grow and actually break out of this dependency theory and become a core nation in the future. Point number 2 is these developmental considerations will keep people safe because of increased infrastructure, and by safety I mean they will have increased protection because their government will be able to afford more police officers, more militaristic protections from outside forces, but they will also have the economy and the economic stability to be able to give them food, water, and shelter. And humanity is more important than the environment. I know they both go very much hand in hand over the world, but if your government can give you more aid and more food, water, and ability to have shelter, that should be the most underlying factor for what you need in your life. The environment's very important, don't get me wrong, but humanity is more important, and your human basic rights and liberty should be upheld first, and developmental considerations will increase the prosperity of the nation. That nation will in turn be able to give you these necessities. My third point I'm going to talk about is it is somewhat hypocritical for the core nations, or the first world nations, to force periphery and semi-periphery nations to make these conservation efforts their priority when they themselves are trying to climb to the core status. These first world nations, or these core nations, violated, or they kind of abused the environment to get to where they are today. And examples are of the United States, Germany's been better, but like Britain and Russia are trying to get these smaller nations to abide by these environmental sanctions, while they themselves have already abused these sanctions, they've abused the environment to grow their own economy, and now in turn they are keeping the people low on the totem pole, lower, to try to save the economy. It's sort of a hypocritical statement. I know it's to help the environment, but you can't keep these people pushed down, or these governments and these nation states pushed down towards the bottom while you did it long ago to improve your economy. So it's kind of a hypocritical statement to put those sanctions down. One example of a nation that did grow from absolute, almost not obscurity, but they did grow over the past 50 years from an agricultural nation to a very industrialized nation that is a huge world power right now, is that of China. In 1960, 60% of China's workforce was actually in the agricultural labor force. Population growth of the industrial sector over the next 30, 40, 50 years really caused that number to go down, and then the industrial sector to rise. From all the way up to 1990, the agricultural force went from 60% in 1960 to 30% in 1990, which is that 30% of people in the workforce were in agriculture instead. And now in 2017, it's even lower. It is about 16% of the Chinese workforce is in agriculture now. What does this mean? This means that this workforce is actually going towards an industrialized state, that the workers are working in industry like creating iron, creating steel, militaristic expansions, militaristic gain, economics. So China has become a huge world power in an economic standpoint and a militaristic standpoint because of their industrialization and their developmental considerations. China did not worry too much about the environmental preservation. As you can tell, in Beijing, there's a smog cloud over it. Yes, there is a problem, but the positives kind of outweigh the negatives because you can see how strong China is right now just because they did this over a 50-year span. China is one of the greatest military powers out there right now, as we can see the problems that are happening in the South China Sea and their militaristic expansion. Kind of a strain with the United States because we're also economically tied with them now. We were in the past, we're very much more economically tied with them now because after their expansions. Overall, they did make the developmental and the economic growth part more of a factor than the environmental preservation, and it really made them prosper as a nation. The environment did suffer a little bit. That's still very much a problem, but the developmental considerations that did arise from China's growth over the past 50 years outweigh what's happened. So, in my opinion, to wrap this up, I do strongly believe that developmental considerations should outweigh environmental preservations because nations require developmental considerations to prosper and fight towards first world and core values, which is the world systems theory and developmental theory. Developmental considerations will keep people safe because they'll get their food, water, and shelter, and the developed nations would have a way to protect them more because of their increased economic growth, and the hypocritical standpoint that the core nations cannot put sanctions on the periphery and semi-periphery because they did the same thing, kind of hurting the environment earlier in the past, and they can't really force them to abide by these rules even though the core nations did it early in the past. Thank you for watching this video. Hope it wasn't too confusing. I know I ramble on sometimes. Hope my points made sense, and thank you very much for watching.